So in my last video, I covered a very fun variant of the Chain Lightning plus Lightning Spear hybrid Sorcerer build for Season 5. And even though it may not be the absolute most busted build, that crowd definitely currently goes to the pure Lightning Spear build with the Fractured Winterglass. But my build is still perfectly viable for efficiently farming endgame content, even tier 7 of the Infernal Hordes. And in today's video, I present the evolution of that build that I'm currently playing, featuring the mythic unique Andariel's Visage. This version of the build actually forgoes Lightning Spear again because of some gearing complications that I'll explain in a bit, but with the Andariel's Visage combined with specifically the Fist of Fate giving you a ton of lucky hit chance, allowing you to proc the helmet a lot more often, and also Chain Lightning kind of uniquely having a decently high lucky hit chance coefficient, plus with Andariel's Visage also enabling a new legendary aspect that you can use to essentially give you infinite mana, solving the problem of Chain Lightning completely, even combined with the new Axial Conduit unique, which drains even more of your mana. And of course, if you don't yet have Andariel's Visage, my previous video covers a perfectly viable Chain Lightning build anyway. Plus, mythic uniques are more easy to obtain than ever, with you essentially getting 3 guaranteed resplendent sparks, with of course you needing 4 to craft one of your choosing. And for your 4th one, you can actually just kill tormented versions of bosses that actually have a decently high chance of dropping one. For example, myself, I actually got 2 Shakos to drop without killing that many tormented bosses even. Or you could also level up another character to get your 4th resplendent spark, redoing the seasonal reputation. Now, going over some of the main things I've updated since my last build, as well as some of the key things to know and to have to be able to run this build optimally. First of all, of course, the helm will change to Andariel's Visage, right? And to be able to fully optimize that, you'll definitely want the Fist of Fate, and ideally you want to have a high lucky hit chance on the Fist of Fate, right? Of course, having a greater affix on it and also being able to masterwork it and hit the lucky hit chance affix when you masterwork would be ideal as well. So there is quite a bit of work that would go into really optimizing this build fully. And by the way, the Fist of Fate drops from the Beast in Ice. He's actually one of the tougher tormented bosses, but as long as you learn the mechanics really well and just try not to get hit, you should be able to handle the tormented version of that boss, which I would recommend to farm the Fist of Fate. And who knows, you might also get lucky and get him to drop some mythic uniques as well, like I have. Next, for resource management, the Andariel's Visage actually has a pretty rare mechanic, which is life on hit, and it gives you a ton of it. And this actually synergizes with a very specific legendary aspect that you can put on your ring, being a resource aspect, and that is the Starlight aspect. So previously, in most Chain Lightning builds, or in my previous Chain Lightning build without Andariel's Visage, right, I was running the recharging aspect. And that is still a pretty good one, which is whenever your Chain Lightning bounces, you gain mana back, and you can also get the aspect from the Zenith dungeon as well, the lowest roll that is. But once you get Andariel's Visage, by using the Starlight aspect, the healing from the Andariel's Visage actually allows your Starlight aspect, which says that you gain primary resource as you heal, to basically cap out your mana constantly. So just with these 2 items, or rather an item and an affix, you pretty much almost completely solved your mana problem. I would say the other sort of aspect to the mana puzzle would be your maximum mana, which as you level up and get to, say, close to level 100, you have made sure to go through the Paragon points to ensure that you have all the maximum mana nodes that you can take. And drinking the Elixir of Resourcefulness will also help you increase your max mana, just to have more consistency, especially with Axial Conduit, the new unique pants, right? Which I would recommend as well. So just having all these compared to before, your mana will be a lot more topped off. And also with that, you'll be able to forego a lot of the other mana regeneration affixes and skill points and things like that, because you just won't really need them anymore. I suppose another thing that's good to have is on your weapon, have a lucky hit chance to restore primary resource. I do currently have that affix on my weapon, but that might actually be a little bit overkill once you have a good roll on your Starlight aspect. Now, another major thing that I re-optimized for this build is for my previous version of the build, especially if you're running Lightning Spear, if you're using the splintering aspect, that is the Lightning Spear aspect that increases its damage, that actually scales with critical strike damage. And so in my previous video, I was recommending people to roll and temper critical strike damage on their gear. However, for Andariel's Visage, because the damage is not only really high, but it'll become one of your main sources of damage, but also because it doesn't actually scale with critical strike damage because it's a damage over time, which does not crit. If you also try to run Lightning Spear with Andariel's Visage, and also Splintering Aspect, these just don't mesh very well, right? I actually tried doing this. Of course, you could argue that Lightning Spear will give you a little bit more lucky hit chance. You'll have a few more projectiles to help you, I suppose, proc your Andariel's Visage. But I've since tried re-optimizing and going for vulnerable damage instead of critical strike damage, omitting Lightning Spear from my build entirely, and just going balls deep with my basically infinite casting of Chain Lightning, especially since my mana has been solved, right? I can basically spam Chain Lightnings even more than before. And of course, I also have some Ice Blades going. But anyhow, my main source of damage will be from spamming Chain Lightnings and going all in almost on the Andariel's Visage damage, which would benefit from, of course, vulnerable damage as I mentioned. Lucky hit chance is extremely great, which Chain Lightning also happens to have a good lucky hit chance coefficient, and things like attack speed are powerful as well. And another key thing here is also that by removing Lightning Spear, I'm also of course not running that splintering aspect, right? Which means I'll not only be able to comfortably use a two-hander and not worry about sort of having to fit in another aspect, I can also run the addition of the vulnerable damage aspect on my amulet, which also increases, by the way, the chance for Ice Blades to apply vulnerable for just a little bit more consistency. But more importantly, even more multiplicative damage for my Andariel's procs. And now, with removing Lightning Spear and critical strike damage, another major piece that I changed is my boots, which previously I was using Asus Heirloom for critical strike damage, of course, and also critical hit chance. But since I'm not using critical strike damage anymore, I've swapped it out to a legendary boots with the aspect of the Orange Herald, which helps me reduce the cooldown on my ultimate. And with that, I can basically have almost infinite uptime on my ultimate as well. And another cool thing is that with the Ice Blades enchantment, I'm able to spam my ultimate as well as my other cooldowns to constantly refresh and get even more Ice Blades out, which would help me increase my damage from Conjuration Mastery as well. So naturally there will be a character planner in the description box as well, but here I'll just briefly go over my skills and my gear. So of course I've swapped over to Andariel's Visage and have been relying on it as one of my primary sources of damage, and I've also spec'd out of critical strike damage as well for the most part on my gear. So anyhow, going over my skill tree really quick before I get into gear. This is pretty standard stuff, of course, compared to my previous version, which you can still check out my video below. But of course, my previous version had Lightning Spear and this one doesn't have it at all. And of course, the rest is also pretty standard though. Firebolt is for the enchantment for burning. And then Chain Lightning is still maxed out with Greater Chain Lightning. I have Elemental Dominance here. I actually put 1 point into Flame Shield, which is different from my build before. This will just help slightly with survivability, but oftentimes if you get one shot, it might not matter that much anyway, but it still helps quite a bit. Here I have Ice Armor, which is really good for barrier and for mana regen. Teleport is standard. I have 1 point here, 3 points to Glass Cannon. I have a couple points here. These are all standard as well, Protection and Mana Shield. I actually like having the lucky hit chance here, just for slightly more Andariel's Visage procs, but if you have a really good Fist of Fate with like a lucky hit chance greater affix and like master working on it, you may not need this amount of lucky hit, or rather this additional amount of lucky hit chance on the skill tree will be pretty negligible compared to the amount you have from your Fist of Fate, so it's kind of up to you. I just like having a bit more damage anyway. Ice Blades is standard, it's really good actually, because it also helps lower the cooldowns on your other skills. And with the enchantment that I'm running, the idea is to actually use stuff like Unstable Currents, of course your Ice Armor, Teleport, and Flame Shield to constantly spawn additional Ice Blades. And with my setup, Unstable Currents basically has no cooldown, so basically every time you press an Unstable Current, you'll proc a free Ice Blades as well, which helps of course with additional cooldown reduction and also applying vulnerable, especially with the shredding blades aspect as well as the storm soul aspect, benefiting from dealing damage to vulnerable targets. And of course, the more ice blades you have spawned through the enchantment effect, the more you'll also be able to benefit from Conjuration Mastery, where you'll have more damage, more movement speed, and more mana regeneration, which will be made even better if you have additional points on it with your amulet, which I currently don't. So this is definitely a way I could still further much more scale up my build. But coming back to the skill tree here, of course I just mentioned I have Conjuration Mastery. Again, this is really good to have on an amulet as well. And if you can get like Greater Affix and Masterworking on it, it'll be really powerful to have your multiple Ice Blades out. Moving on here, Devouring Blaze, I just said that critical strike damage doesn't work with Andariel's Visage, but this is kind of just like a nice place to have some extra points or put some extra points in, and it's just kind of an efficient per point damage anyhow, without necessarily it, really benefiting the Andariels anyway. Coming down here, I have Static Discharge just to form Crackling Energies. This is nice if you're using the charged Paragon glyph, because every time you pick up Crackling Energy, you gain 5% increased damage up to 15% as a multiplier, which is pretty high. Moving on, compared to last time, by the way, I'm not using Invigorating Conduit anymore because, as I've explained, my mana problems have pretty much been completely solved with using Andariel's Visage plus the Starlight aspect. So I don't need this as well. And coming down, I have Unstable Currents with the Prime Unstable Currents for attack speed. And then I actually added points compared to last time to Convulsions because I'm not running Lightning Spear for the stun anymore, but instead I'm running Convulsions, so I'll still be able to pretty frequently stun enemies with my Chain Lightning, especially now being able to spam them a lot more. And of course, Electrocution is standard, and down here I have Veer's Mastery, whereas last time for my Lightning Spear variant I had Overflowing Energy. Now going over gear really quick, Andariel's Visage is a given. Again, the damage actually scales with your weapon damage, and that's why I'm using a two-hander as well. Technically, with a one-hander and offhand, you'll be able to attack faster, but I found that the additional damage with using a two-hander on the proc, it's actually a lot more damage, so I think it's actually worth it. And moving on for my chest, ideally you'll want to have Tyrael's Might as well if you're able to get the Uber Unique or craft it, but here I'm just using a pretty standard legendary armor with some additional armor rolls to get armor cap, and also a defensive aspect, mainly the Snow Veiled here. Next, Fist of Fate is crucial to have. You get it from the Beast in Ice. And Beast in Ice is actually kind of a difficult fight, but as long as you learn the mechanics, it shouldn't be that bad either. Took me a few tries to get the Fist of Fate, and this is far from a perfect roll either. You want as high of lucky hit chance as you can. It can actually spawn as low as like basically almost zero lucky hit chance, so the variance is really high on the Fist of Fate as well, but you would want to farm the tormented version of the Beast and Ice to get a good version of this. So this is really important because the lucky hit chance, of course, increases your odds of proccing the Andariel's Visage, and combined with Chain Lightning, you have a really high lucky hit chance as well. Moving on, Axial Conduit, I'm still using it. The effect that allows Chain Lightnings to sort of auto-target and orbit around you is actually underrated in my opinion and really helpful. So you don't really have to go out of your way compared to like previous versions of Chain Lightning in like previous season, like season 1. With this, you can actually kind of just set and forget or just like auto-target your Chain Lightnings, which is really, really convenient. And of course, the explosion from this helps a lot as well. And even though it drains your mana, for each Chain Lightning you get drained 66 mana, as long as you're using the Starlight aspect, because what it says is for every 20% of life that you heal, you gave however much primary resource, and since Andariel's Visage gives you a ton of life on hit, you'll basically be full on mana like pretty much constantly. So these two items alone will completely solve your mana issues. But if you don't have Andariel's Visage, for whatever reason, you can also use the recharging aspect where you gain mana from Chain Lightning bounces, which is also what I used in my previous non-Andariel's Visage version of this build with Lightning Spear, right? Moving on, these are pretty standard boots, just int, max life, movement speed, a double movement speed roll with like a crowd control tempering. I also have the crowd control tempering on my chest. This is just to like increase my survivability very slightly, but it's kind of like not that important either. I have the Orange Herald aspect here. It's really great for reducing the cooldown on your unstable currents, which then once you have like virtually no cooldown on your unstable currents, you can basically spam it, and also through the Ice Blades enchantment, spawn a bunch of Ice Blades through that as well. and just like kind of snowball from there, which is really cool. Back to my weapon. Also, I wanted to quickly mention that for your offensive tempering options, affixes, you want to go for vulnerable damage generally, because again, critical strike damage does not benefit Andariel's Visage. For the other tempering, I have chance to cast 2 Chain Lightnings, and then a really important stat to have on your weapon is lucky hit chance to restore primary resource. I actually have a greater affix on this, and if you don't have a greater affix, you might also want to hit it with masterworking. So getting up to like 50% plus with this affix will also help quite a bit with your mana regeneration. But again, if you have a high roll on your Starlight combined with Andariel's Visage, this might actually become a lot more optional as well. Moving on to my amulet, this is far from ideal. You want ranks to like Conjuration Mastery and Glass Cannon, and for the last one you can get like percent intelligence or attack speed. Both are pretty good. Critical strike chance is okay, but again, it doesn't benefit Andariel's Visage, but it can help you proc things like Crackling Energy and also reduce damage from enemies whenever you crit them, right? Via your skill tree here where you have Electrocution. The aspect I have here is the Ice Blade's vulnerable one, and it also gives you additional vulnerable damage, which is nice. And you'll have lots of Ice Blades floating around, and with Paragon, you'll also be able to use your Chain Lightnings to make enemies vulnerable too. So you actually have a lot of enemies be vulnerable around you, even without using like Frost Nova, with just your Chain Lightning and Ice Blades. So that's why you want to run Storm Swell and Shredding Blades, quite good. Another potential option might be like Accelerating Aspect to increase your attack speed, but I find that might probably be a little bit overkill, though I haven't technically really tested that either. Moving on to my rings, again, Starlight is really strong. For affixes here, Int, Crit Strike chance, and attack speed are pretty good here. And again, for the tempering, you can take Unstable Currents cooldown, also on your amulet as well, by the way. And notice that I still have critical strike damage on this, so that's definitely suboptimal. I would want to have vulnerable damage, of course, but I do have the vulnerable damage roll on my ring. And of course, for my last ring, this is super standard across almost all Sorc builds, and that's the Tarashos Iridescent Loop, on which I actually don't have a very good damage multiplier roll either, so that's something I'm looking to upgrade as well. As for Paragon, I'll actually kind of just skim through it. It's almost the same as my previous version with Lightning Spear with some very minor changes. So for my glyphs, I'm running Unleash for slightly more mana regeneration and increased damage, but you might actually want to swap this out once you have your Starlight aspect, but it's still pretty decent. Here I have Destruction. Again, crit strike damage is not that great, but there's also not that many great multipliers left anymore anyway, so it's probably fine. I am running Static Surge as I mentioned for Legendary node, and a lot of the rare nodes here I just have like maximum mana. This is really strong because once you have, even though you have your Starlight aspect to regenerate mana, without a lot higher maximum mana, which you, by the way, you also want to combine and increase your maximum mana with the Elixir Resourcefulness too. I think this helps the most out of all the elixirs, despite there being one for attack speed and lucky hit chance. This will technically increase your damage more, but I think the max resource is more consistent because it'll allow your Chain Lightnings to not accidentally fall off once you have like 9 or 10 Chain Lightnings at once. So I think the max resource is really good, and that's why I have it on my Paragon. Moving on for some other glyphs, I have Elementalist, some maximum life glyphs where I can take them. Of course, all this is in the description box below as well, but Tactician is quite good. Safeguard for damage reduction from elites as a rare node. Some more maximum mana here is really helpful, as I mentioned. I took out the Elemental Summoner node here, which I had in my previous version, but that was with Lightning Spear, right? Here I'm still running Charge, and I am still generating Crackling Energy for a pretty decent multiplier, and I'm running Flame Feeder. Next Exploit is nice for additional vulnerable damage and increasing your damage multiplier, and Frigid Fate is pretty nice too, just for some additional vulnerable damage. And that is my update to my Chain Lightning build featuring the busted Mythic Unique Andariel's Visage. Of course, there is still space for even more Mythic Uniques if you get them, like Tyrael's Might and potentially, I suppose, the Ring of Starless Skies, but I'm not really sure how the mana would work out with that. But anyhow, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'll be sure to comment back as well. Consider subscribing to my channel for more cutting edge videos. And with that, happy hunting, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.